In the final days of World War II, as the Third Reich was collapsing into chaos, one of the strangest and most unlikely battles of the entire conflict unfolded in the Austrian Alps. It was May 1945. Berlin had fallen. Adolf Hitler was dead. German forces across Europe were surrendering in waves. Entire divisions were laying down their weapons. Yet in the midst of this crumbling empire, a medieval fortress known as Castle Itter became the stage for a confrontation that defied everything the war had represented up to that point. Castle Itter stood on a hill overlooking the village of the same name, its stone walls centuries old, its towers rising above the valley below. During the war, the Nazis had transformed it into a special detention facility for prominent French prisoners. Unlike the overcrowded camps scattered across Europe, this was a place reserved for political figures, generals, and influential captives considered valuable to the regime. Among those imprisoned there were former French Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, General Maurice Gamelin, and even relatives of Charles de Gaulle. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were bargaining chips in a war that was now clearly lost. By early May 1945, the command structure surrounding the castle was unraveling. The SS units responsible for guarding high-profile prisoners were increasingly desperate. Communication lines were breaking down. Supplies were inconsistent. Rumors of Hitler's death spread rapidly, shaking even the most loyal followers. Some guards abandoned their posts. Others removed their insignia, hoping to blend into the civilian population before Allied troops arrived. The rigid discipline that had defined Nazi authority was dissolving into uncertainty and fear. Inside the castle, the French prisoners sensed the shift. Gunfire echoed faintly from distant valleys as Allied forces pushed deeper into Austria. The once confident demeanor of their captors had changed. Orders were unclear. Tension was visible. The prisoners understood something critical. In moments of collapse, fanaticism often becomes more dangerous. If hardline SS units decided that surrender was unacceptable, they might execute the prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. Among the German officers in the region was Major Joseph Gangl, a Wehrmacht officer who had grown increasingly disillusioned with the SS. Unlike the ideological zealots, Gangl recognized that the war was over. Austria was being torn apart in the final convulsions of a dying regime. Civilian lives were at risk. Meaningless violence continued only because some refused to accept reality. Gangl faced a choice that carried enormous personal risk. If he openly defied the SS, he would be labeled a traitor. If he did nothing, innocent people could be massacred that he chose to act. Gangl established contact with elements of the Austrian resistance and then sought out nearby American forces advancing through the region. It was an extraordinary move. Just days earlier, American and German troops had been locked in lethal combat. Now, under a white flag, a German officer approached the enemy with a proposal: cooperate to prevent a massacre at Castle Itter. Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., commanding troops of the U.S. 12th Armored Division, listened carefully. Lee was a seasoned officer. He had fought through some of the war's fiercest engagements. The German army had inflicted enormous casualties on Allied forces. Trusting a Wehrmacht officer was not a simple decision. But Lee understood the larger picture. The war was ending. The SS remained dangerous. And if what Gangl said was true, lives hung in the balance. Lee agreed. What followed was almost surreal. American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops climbed into vehicles together. They coordinated routes. They shared intelligence. The very uniforms that had symbolized bitter enemies now moved side by side toward a common objective. The alliance was fragile, built not on ideology, but on necessity and conscience. When they reached Castle Itter on May 5, 1945, the defenders quickly assessed their position. The castle's walls were sturdy, but not invincible. Ammunition was limited. Communications were unreliable. The French prisoners, though not trained infantry, were determined to survive. Some even insisted on participating in the defense. Pride and survival instinct overrode hesitation. They would not die in captivity days before freedom. Meanwhile, a force of Waffen-SS troops was advancing toward the castle. These were not ordinary soldiers seeking surrender. They were die-hard loyalists, men who believed that resistance must continue regardless of Germany's collapse. To them, the prisoners represented symbols of defeat and humiliation. Allowing them to be liberated was unacceptable to at dawn. The attack began. SS troops surrounded the castle and opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off ancient stone. Mortar shells exploded in the courtyard, sending debris into the air. The defenders responded from windows and towers. American machine guns cut across the valley. German rifles fired at fellow Germans. The sound of combat echoed through the mountains in a final, chaotic clash of a dying war. Captain Lee positioned a Sherman tank at the castle gate to reinforce the defense. It became both shield and target. SS anti-tank fire eventually disabled it, leaving the entrance exposed. Smoke poured into the courtyard. Ammunition dwindled. Every minute felt uncertain. Reinforcements were not guaranteed. The defenders understood they might be overwhelmed. Major Gangle moved bravely between positions, coordinating fire and encouraging both Americans and Germans to hold firm. In one pivotal moment, as he attempted to move former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud to safety, a sniper's bullet struck him. He fell, fatally wounded. A German officer died protecting French prisoners from German SS troops, fighting alongside American soldiers. In that instant, the war's rigid lines of allegiance blurred into something far more human. The battle intensified. Inside the castle, prisoners carried ammunition, tended to wounded defenders, and even manned defensive positions. What had once been a prison had transformed into a fortress of shared survival. The defenders were outnumbered and under heavy pressure. If reinforcements did not arrive soon, the outcome would be grim. Then, through the smoke and gunfire, hope appeared. Elements of the U.S. 142nd Infantry Regiment advanced toward the castle after receiving word of the engagement. Attacking from outside, they struck the SS forces from the rear. Caught between two fronts, the SS attackers faltered. Some were killed, others surrendered. The siege collapsed that by evening. Castle Itter was secure. 2 days later, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe ended. Across the continent, celebrations erupted. Yet in the Austrian Alps, the memory of that extraordinary battle lingered. The Battle of Castle Itter became known as one of the strangest engagements of World War II, a moment when former enemies united against extremism in the final hours of conflict. It did not alter the grand strategy of the war. It did not decide the fate of nations, but it revealed something profound. Even in a war defined by hatred, ideology, and destruction, individual choices could defy the narrative. Major Gangle chose conscience over blind loyalty. Captain Lee chose cooperation over suspicion. Prisoners chose courage over despair. In the shadow of a collapsing empire, men who had once tried to kill each other stood together against fanaticism. The castle's ancient stones witnessed not just gunfire, but transformation. The war that had divided the world ended with one final, improbable alliance. And in those final hours of World War II in Europe, on a hilltop fortress in Austria, history recorded a truth often forgotten in the scale of global conflict. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is the decision to protect life, even when the world around you is falling apart.